Hello, we're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan,
This is WaffleByte,
where we bring you interesting bites about technology,
business,
and things that might change the world.
You can find all our sources in the description,
and you can skip to the chapters you're most interested in.
But for now, enjoy the show.
Today, we take a look at the effect of US tariffs, which seem to be on everyone's mind right now, Meta's antitrust case, and Instagram's new feature.
And we learn why Norway's government has the world's largest investment fund at $1.7 trillion.
And our thought for the episode is, a robot just ran a half marathon. Why? Our first topic concerns tariffs. So on April the 2nd, which Trump claimed was, quote, Liberation Day, he imposed substantial tariffs on many of the USA's trading partners. Now, after substantial market turmoil, he paused most of these tariffs except a 145% reciprocal tariff on China. Now, these tariffs are essentially taxes on importers, and it makes the prices of imports more expensive, and this is supposedly with the goal of benefiting local manufacturing and jobs. Now, of course, from the perspective of the United States, a substantial amount of things are imported from China, and this includes a lot of consumer technology items. And these tariffs have an outsized effect on this industry because of the fact that supply chains in China are rather difficult to replace. And actually, I was in Shenzhen, which is the Chinese tech hub, and I was visiting the malls, and you could buy absolutely everything, right? So you can see why, with these complicated supply chains, that it's important that there's somebody who sells like everything you could possibly need very close to you. It just makes everything much more efficient. But Best Buy, which is a major US retailer of consumer electronics, warned that tariffs will likely raise prices. Historically, we've seen that with tariffs, almost all of the additional cost of the tariff actually gets passed on to the consumer. In other words, it just means higher prices for consumers. But what we've seen with Trump's new tariffs is that because they're so high, it does seem unlikely that all of the prices can be passed on to consumers, because consumers probably simply can't afford for everything to be 10% more expensive, or in the case of certain Chinese goods, to be double the price, right? If all of the tariff is passed on to the consumer. So I think the first and biggest example of something notable that was really affected by the tariffs was the Nintendo Switch 2. So Nintendo actually released the Switch 2 a while ago, and I believe they were stockpiling enough Switch 2s to avoid scalping, so they only launched it recently. But with the announcement of the tariffs, they actually explicitly said that because of tariffs, they had to delay the launch of the Switch 2. Now, the problem was that even though they stockpiled a good amount of these Switches, because of tariffs, they could not guarantee that they would have further Switch 2s to sell at the launch price, which was $450. However, it seems that more recently it emerged that they have sufficient manufacturing capacity in Vietnam. And so what they're going to do is they're going to direct the Vietnamese supply to the US market, whilst the Chinese made Switches will be sold everywhere else, which, as a reminder, does not have these ridiculous tariffs on Chinese imports. But actually, Vietnam themselves previously had a 46% tariff, which was announced on Liberation Day, but this was paused for 90 days, as we said earlier, by Trump. And so now, really, there's only a 10% tariff, which is obviously much better than the 145% tariff on China. And it seems as though that rumors are that Nintendo will start pre-orders for the Switch by the end of April at the same price. So they've managed to play around with supply chains to not have to raise prices for consumers. Another company, which is majorly affected by this is Apple, because obviously Apple relies disproportionately on selling physical goods, right? Whereas Google is selling ads, Apple is selling iPhones, and physical goods, in this case iPhones, are disproportionately affected by tariffs, right? Because they're imports. So it seems as though, to soften the impact of tariffs, Apple charters, I believe it was like up to 10 cargo jets to fly 600 tons of iPhones from India to the US ahead of the tariffs, so that they would have, I suppose, a small stockpile of phones for American consumers. However, it seems as though, whilst these 600 tons of iPhones is around 1.5 million units, Apple sells over 120 million iPhones in the United States yearly. So, if you do some quick maths, right, this is not lasting very long at all. It's lasting maybe a couple of days, in addition to whatever stock Apple already has.
How on earth does Apple manage to sell 120 million iPhones in the USA? That's like 1 in every 3 Americans purchasing a new iPhone every single year.
It is quite crazy, isn't it? I mean, the United States is a huge market for Apple, right? And they have tremendous market share. I think possibly the biggest from a percentage perspective of people who use iPhones. And with people losing iPhones, breaking iPhones, getting second iPhones, company iPhones, it's no wonder that they make so much money selling iPhones. And the fact that they're still a nearly $3 trillion company, even though obviously markets crashed after the tariff announcement, it's just crazy. I mean, they make so much money selling iPhones that it's simply unfathomable for most of us. But I think it's quite possible that Apple will do something quite similar to Nintendo, which is to say they'll use iPhone and other production capacity in countries like India and Vietnam and Southeast Asia for the US market in particular, while they'll use the rest, so the Chinese capacity, for all the other countries which I must say have been sensible and not imposed huge tariffs on China. But it's important to remember how much stuff the United States buys from China, right? So it's not just phones, laptops. I think around 2/3 of all American laptop are made in China and therefore imported from China. And so you're likely to see price increases there. I was looking at the websites of the different laptop manufacturers, and they seemed to not have any warnings or any preemptive price increases. So I suppose it's possible that people are anticipating that, given how huge these tariffs are, something will be done in order for these to not exist, basically, in 6 months' time. Otherwise, there'll be a complete disruption to US-China trade, which is, of course, extremely significant.
As we know, Tim Cook is the supply chain guy, so I'm pretty sure that Apple, at the end of the day, will probably be fine with this. Not only because they have a huge amount of money in the bank, but they can also find a way to essentially avoid these tariffs, whether that be through supply chains or whether that be through Tim Cook cozying up to Trump continuously.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to realize that these tariffs won't make an iPhone $3,000, right? That's not how it works. Because if you think about it, firstly, as we said earlier, Apple does have some capacity in other parts of Asia, notably not in the United States, but they can leverage these Indian iPhones or those made in Vietnam to serve the US market. But also that even if you do need to pay, say, a 10% tariff, that is paid on the import price of the iPhone, right? So if an iPhone is imported for around $500, which seems to be about right for the higher end iPhones, then you're paying a $50 tariff. And when Apple sells that for $1,000, right, that 50% is only that $50 is only making the iPhone $1,050 instead of something ridiculous. But of course, if you need to pay an 100% tariff, that does shake things up a bit. But that doesn't seem to be something that will happen. Certainly, I'm sure Tim Cook will make sure that nobody pays $1,500 for an iPhone because that simply won't sell, and they want to protect their bottom line, obviously. Our next topic concerns antitrust. And despite what many people hoped, this current US administration is not necessarily taking a laissez-faire approach towards antitrust enforcement. And Meta and its founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, are currently in deep trouble with the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission. So the FTC is investigating Meta for its acquisition of Instagram in 2012, which it deems that it may be anti-competitive, right? This is in spite of the fact that the FTC actually approved this deal back then when it went through. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, or Zuck, who has recently taken a sharp pivot, I must say, in public image, no doubt with the goal of pleasing Trump, was rather dismayed to find out that the FTC's case against his company was not dropped. So he previously had lobbied very hard for it to be dropped, and apparently he was confident, given his newfound engagement with the Trump administration and people orbiting Trump, including paying $1 million for his inauguration, etc., that they would essentially be kind and Donald Trump would step in to drop this case. But even though he offered to settle for around $500 million, which a lot of people said was a menial amount, this was not dropped. And apparently people close to Trump told him to not drop this case and reminded Trump of his previously more adversarial relationship with Mark Zuckerberg. And in fact, the now president once suggested that Mark Zuckerberg should be jailed for some of the things he did previously. Now, Lina Khan, who, as some may remember, very fondly perhaps, was the former chair of the FTC and whose work that the J.D. Vance, the current vice president, and many others, including me, have praised, quoted in saying that Mark bought his way out of competing, so I'm not surprised that he thinks he can buy his way out of law enforcement too. And I thought that was a very powerful quote coming out of Lina Khan. Now, on top of this current antitrust case against Meta, there was a recent Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on a whistleblower about if Mark Zuckerberg had lied to Congress and essentially worked with the CCP to advance their interest in the name, of course, of profits for Meta. And reportedly, Meta is accused of manufacturing censorship tools for the CCP, as well as endangering American user data by allowing those in Hong Kong and in Taiwan for their data to be stored essentially on Chinese soil. And so when American users engage with these users, their data is endangered. And what struck me, and I'm sure it struck you as well, Sourish, was that Mark Zuckerberg really did not do himself any favors in some of the emails he sent previously in the past.
Indeed, I saw the email about wanting to purchase Snapchat for $6 billion almost 10 years ago, I think.
Yes, and that's not the only one, right? He previously said that they basically need to buy Instagram and not compete with it. He also said once in actually 2018 that they may have to spin off Instagram if the antitrust people come knocking. And he's also previously, within Meta, obviously, some of the executives have stated things in line with working essentially with the Chinese Communist Party. And I must say that has not boded very well for Mark Zuckerberg. And the problem is, I think that even though there are these hearings and there's this evidence, I fear that very little actually gets done, because from the perspective of enforcement, it's very difficult to create a solution for these very real problems that people have identified, right? Short of simply breaking up, say, Meta or previously Google, who also actually lost their antitrust case and now are waiting for a hearing, there's not much you can do. And so what we find is that people essentially get away with all of this, supposedly anti-competitive behavior which of course is detrimental, right? Because competition is ultimately good for the consumer, and you need a functioning market in order for competition to thrive. And if you have a big monopoly like Instagram, like WhatsApp, and like Google, then competition simply doesn't thrive. And I think that's quite unfortunate. And I think that in the past, maybe there has been insufficient antitrust enforcement. And so now we're dealing with the consequences of
But
that.
at the end of the day, Zuck is still the second richest person on the planet, and he still controls some of the biggest social networks that history has ever seen. And so there's very little you can actually do against him. Even someone like Donald Trump can't and won't really do a whole lot against Zuck because of how much weight Zuck punches.
Yes, that's quite right. And I'm sure a lot of people will have their opinions on that and not necessarily a favourable manner. But at the end of the day, I do think that Zuck will emerge mostly unscathed from this. I don't think a breakup is possible, or I think that if a breakup does happen, that will be like truly a huge thing, and I think that will have major knock-on consequences. And short of a breakup, I don't see what anybody can do to really damage Mark Zuckerberg's social media empire, because as a reminder, billions and billions of people use his services every day. So it's not something you can simply do anything about, really. And we see that competition isn't really doing much in the social media space, at least.
On another note, I'm actually quite a huge fan of targeted advertising because I find, especially over time, it becomes more and more useful to me. And I've got access to some pretty cool things through targeted adverts that I found on Instagram. And at this point, half the reason I even use Instagram is just to see those targeted adverts because the algorithm is just so good.
Well, that's how they make their money, isn't it? And so, obviously, it's proven tremendously effective for them because, people like you click on these adverts and buy things. And obviously, that is financially rewarding for Meta. But I think there are concerns with the fact that they're getting too good and they're stealing all your data. And there's concerns about vulnerable people getting predatory advertisements and causing them to spend all of their money. So obviously there are concerns with this, but I would suggest that firstly, they have all your data anyways. And secondly, I think people need to be more conscious of what they're buying. Impulse purchase perhaps are not necessarily very wise. And I think there's some responsibility with the end user as well as these advertising companies in having a healthy relationship with buying stuff that you see on social media. Our final topic also concerns Instagram, because Instagram is rolling out a new feature called Blend. And this is meant to allow a group of friends to curate a set of reels for their fellow friends to see. And so you can browse these curated reels, you can react to them, and you can talk about them in DMs. And this was a new feature that Instagram is rolling out to certain selected users by invitation only. Now, Spotify also has a similar feature with their playlist where you can curate and share playlists with your friends. But TikTok does not have this feature. And I think Instagram is quite keen on differentiating themselves with TikTok, who still seem to exist in the United States, by the way, even though they were meant to be sold like many times already. But I think this was interesting because it seems as though that instead of doom scrolling by yourself, Instagram now wants you to doom scroll with your friends. And maybe you're doing that already, but it seems as though that this is Meta's next step in capturing your engagement and trying to make you and your friends doom scroll together so that you spend collectively more time on Instagram. And that obviously has huge financial upsides for Meta. Sourish, do you see this in the same way that I do?
Kind of, but I have a very personal opinion or very personal position on this topic because I keep getting sent reels on Instagram and I really hate it to the point where I've just muted my Instagram DMs because they're just filling up with reels every single day from these idiots who think I actually care about watching these stupid reels. And it's so annoying. And I do not like this feature because it seems to me that it will simply encourage more and more people to essentially send me more and more reels. And that's just going to irritate me even more and essentially just ban my friends, which is really irritating. And Reels are just really stupid. And like anything that encourages people to spend more time on Reels is just a stupid feature.
I think that that might count as an unpopular opinion there, because I think it's unequivocal that Reels have proven to be extremely popular amongst, especially our demographic, but also it seems many people. They love Reels. They spend possibly too much time on them, and they enjoy sharing this. And I think this does make sharing Reels easier, right? If you have a good friend and you possibly you have similar taste in Reels, then this might be a very convenient feature. And if you put aside your personal distaste towards Reels, Sourish, do you not think that this will increase user engagement on? From Meta's perspective, do you not think that this will like make people spend more time essentially because they can share Reels more easily?
This is just like a fascinating problem to solve, at least from Meta's perspective, because they want to maximize the time spent on their platform, and there are like a billion different ideas that you could have to try and achieve this. And clearly, for whatever reason, Meta believes this is a big route through which they can achieve this. And I do think that they will probably succeed because, people love scrolling on Reels. Even if they're sitting physically next to each other, they will both be, like, two people will be on their phone scrolling through Reels. And I think to now connect those two people and allow them to do it together, I think would be very powerful for Meta. And I do think it would increase engagement.
I also think this is actually quite a clever differentiation point with TikTok, because obviously TikTok is a huge rival of Instagram's from the perspective of short form vertical video and how much time people spend on these platforms. But really, it's possibly more difficult to send and share things on TikTok, right? It seems as though that when somebody attempts to share a TikTok, that is not done through TikTok, that is done through a third-party platform. And so by integrating the sharing feature in Instagram, and Instagram obviously itself has Reels, it seems as though that it makes it easier for the sharing of Reels, even more so than before. And I think this will be possibly quite a compelling feature. And I do think that TikTok may be threatened by this. It's something that they don't have, and it's something that Instagram and Meta does have thanks to their ecosystem.
I also think this will essentially cause a whole new genre of Reels to be born, where whatever these Reels are, but they will encourage some sort of real social interaction between other people. Like, for example, send this Reel with a friend and play together or whatever. Because you see quite a lot of people kind of gaming the system and trying to come up with more creative ways to increase their engagement. And for whatever reason, the general population on social media seems to love such content. So it will actually be kind of interesting to see how creators respond to this and what types of Reels now become trendy.
Yes, possibly we might see these Reels even encourage real human interaction, which seems to have been replaced by doom scrolling on social media for a lot of people in a lot of instances.
I mean, if they do that, then Meta will obviously just remove them and replace them with a feature that decreases that.
Yes, of course.
Norway has some crazy geography. Despite being the size of Japan, Norway is home to 1/20th as many people, a population of just 5.6 million. The landscape is harsh, with 2/3 of it being mountains, and it has less arable land than Egypt. And yet, they have the world's largest investment fund. An astonishing $2 trillion of assets is managed by the government, equivalent to over $350,000 per citizen. Whilst countries such as Nigeria or Iraq have seen oil as a curse, and Saudi Arabia has bought off its citizens with short-term spending but is now scrambling for longer-term investments, Norway has faced almost no problems with its resource-rich geography. Whilst recent events including Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Trump's tariffs have shocked the world and caused widespread havoc, the country of Norway has not only remained stable but profited, all the while following a core set of ethical principles. So, how on earth have they managed it, and what's going on today?
someone several decades ago were really smart on how to deal with the income from this industry.
Why don't we have a wealth fund? Other countries have wealth funds. We have nothing. We have nothing.
Yeah, so it's one of the great success stories of this country, right?
It has now become the world's largest fund.
But the warning signs are there.
We must not make small problems big. It's the most watched number in the country.
Chapter 1. A quick history lesson. To understand how Norway has ended up so rich and stable, we need to take a look back 1,000 years. Despite being harsh and mountainous, the Vikings leveraged Norway's network of rivers and extensive coastline for both trade and invasion. In fact, Norway's border is essentially a scribble, making it the world's second largest coastline, right after Canada, and far more than the countries of Indonesia or Russia. Fast forward to the 1800s, and Norway is exporting timber and fish like crazy, their fleet accounting for a whopping 7% of global merchant ships. In this period, they also scaled their agricultural output and exported 340,000 tons of ice. Yes, they literally just cut out blocks of ice and put them on a ship for England. But their reliance on international markets, particularly Britain, screwed them over in the 1880s, when several percent of the people emigrated in hopes for a better future. By 1905, though, things picked up again as the timber and food industries continued to grow. Importantly, however, Norsk Hydro was formed. They started off by creating fertilizer, but over the next 100 years expanded into aluminium, heavy water and hydroelectric production, and today they employ 35,000 Norwegians, and a third of the company is actually owned by the government. They faced huge bursts of success and huge struggle throughout the 1900s, but everything changed for Norway in 1969.
Ekofisk will soon celebrate its 16th anniversary as an oil-producing field. The daily amounts of oil and gas will continue to decrease, but we estimate that production will be profitable until the middle of the next century, 2040, 2050, maybe even longer.
Chapter 2. Black Gold. In 1969, the Norwegians got their Christmas gift. Rewinding a little, people didn't believe that the Norwegian continental shelf contained much oil and gas, but the discovery of a significant gas field in the Netherlands in 1959 challenged that. As Americans do, the Phillips Petroleum Company, now known as Phillips 66, quickly asked Norway for an exclusive deal to hunt for gas. But Norway refused to give exclusive access. They did, however, realize the potential of opening up the seas for resource exploration. But at that time, the maritime borders between Norway and Britain still weren't sorted out for whatever reason. Perhaps they were just ignored as wars got in the way, and no one really cared. But eventually, in 1965, an agreement was reached. The countries drew the median line between both landmasses and called it a day there, which was a slight mistake from Britain's behalf. Because just 1 month and 3 days later, Norway began the first licensing round on their half of the North Sea, clearly eager to look for oil and gas. Drilling started a year later, but nothing was found for 3 painfully expensive years. Many leads turned cold, and the Norwegians' initial suspicions remained true. Of course, Norway was still raking in the money from these energy companies, so they were just doing fine regardless. But then, on Christmas Eve in 1969, the year of man's first step on the moon, Phillips and the Norwegian government confirmed that a huge oil field was found, and almost all of it just about lied on the north side of the maritime border with Britain. The field was called Ekofisk. Over the next few decades, over 15 billion barrels worth of oil were found in Norway's seas, and suddenly, the country became very, 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 very rich. Chapter 3. Post-oil. Norway continued extracting oil and gas, making billions every year. They also stockpiled a fair amount of it, which came in handy in 2022 when Europe cut off as much of Russia's energy supplies as it could.
The energy landscape in Europe will never be the same, and that the Norwegian continental shelf has become extremely important for the European energy system in the situation here and now, and will be important for many years going forward, because it will be one of the primary resources for oil and gas into the European energy system also going forward.
Combined with soaring prices, Norway's revenue from gas and oil exceeded $100 billion for a few years, though just to put that into context, Apple makes that much every single quarter. Norway became even more critical to the resilience and stability of Europe overnight. And Norway didn't even need most of the oil and gas that they were selling, because their electricity mix is 99% renewable, mostly from hydroelectric dams, of which the country has hundreds scattered around its mountains, fed by the constant rain coming from the same place we in Britain get our rain from. And also, the rest of the energy came from wind. The potential to keep building out wind farms, though, remains really high today, and Norway is actually in talks to build transmission lines to mainland Europe to sell loads of excess electricity.
One of the big challenges in the shift to renewable energy is the intermittency of supply. Sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, but hydropower could help fill the gap. In effect, Norway could be a giant battery for the UK.
Norway, in fact, has the most vibrant electric vehicle market in the world, as they offer generous benefits for buyers of EVs, and this yet again reduces their dependence on oil, whilst also stabilizing their economy, somewhat buffering it against the volatility of oil and gas. Chapter 4. The Fund. And that brings us to today, the world's largest single investment fund. It goes by a couple names. The official is the Government Pension Fund Global, but it's often referred to as NBIM, the government's owned company running the fund.
We have seen so many other countries throughout history that have not been able to manage these kind of revenues in a sustainable, responsible way. And we would very much like to avoid the same things happening in Norway as we have seen in other countries, spending too much money too fast. And that's the main reason why we have been able to establish a broad consensus in Norway.
The fund is a very long-term investment that hopes to manage and grow oil money for the Norwegian people. In the press, CEO Nicolai Tangen always emphasizes how it's the people's money, but we'll come back to him later.
I think the concept of sovereign wealth funds, which, this is an example of, has become very popular recently around the world. But I think, it only works when essentially you have a lot of money, right? Because for most countries, we're spending more money than we have. We're borrowing. And so it doesn't make sense to have a sovereign wealth fund if that's what you're doing. But my understanding is with these countries that have huge petroleum revenues, you have more money than you can spend, right? And so it makes sense to save this later for a rainy day. And I think Norway is very unique in that it has actually managed to do that. A lot of other countries simply fail. And I think that is a tremendous testament to Norway, essentially as a country, because it has proven to be a really difficult thing to do with the resource curse.
Indeed, from the very beginning, Norway had a focus on ensuring that their oil wealth would be managed responsibly and serve the country for generations. The role of petroleum activity in Norwegian society was a 1974 report submitted by the Ministry of Finance, discussing how the situation should be handled from a political, geographical, and economical point of view. It modelled different scenarios of tax, how Norway would interact with the global industry, and it has loads of uncanny similarities with the situations we see today. And 22 years of discussion later, the fund receives its first transaction from the government.
And it is probably the most important piece of paper in modern Norwegian history.
All of the money in the fund is invested abroad in about 9,000 different companies today. And this has in fact been a huge benefit, as the Norwegian kroner has weakened significantly over time relative to the dollar and even other currencies like the pound, which almost buffers the country against weak FX rates. Initially, super safe investments are prioritized, with the fund comprising almost entirely of government bonds. But as their risk tolerance grew over the decades, the fund began investing in more and more equities. Today, it holds 1.5% of all the shares in publicly listed companies globally, despite Norway's GDP being just 0.3% of the world.
That's such a crazy statistic because we hear these companies like BlackRock, who some people say they basically own like every company in the world, right? They own shares, but like we don't really think about Norway as a country owning shares in everything in the world. And theoretically, like this gives them like non-negligible power from the perspective of being shareholders of all these companies. And it's it's just crazy that this is a thing, and we don't really think about it because we view Norway as sort of like a peaceful country almost, and they're not seen as troublemakers, if you will. But like it is such a big pie if you think about it, and they do have tremendous influence if they wish to use it, I suppose.
Yes, I do think that they are almost, I wouldn't say they're pulling strings yet, but I do think they have the power to, and that they every now and then decide to tug on the strings slightly.
And what was very interesting about them is that they emphasize responsible investments as one of the cornerstones of their investments. So that's the principle upon which they base all their investments.
The fund also has a focus on following ethical guidelines, first set out in 2004 and updated over time to be more and more stringent as public pressure mounted.
Being the largest, I think that comes with the responsibility, but the other side is that Norway's gotten a lot of good press for this, and it's an icon, the ethics guidelines, so I think it's really important to carry on.
The Norwegians see their fund as a powerful tool to sway the investment guidelines of others.
Norwegians want to sleep well at night knowing that the money they're investing is not being used to commit human rights abuses or egregious environmental harm.
The fund is operationally run by NBIM, Norges Bank Investment Management, but the strategy and oversight is set by the Ministry of Finance. The system was built from the ground up to eliminate corruption and maximize responsible long-term investing.
We have a very constant investment philosophy, and I think that's really one of the success factors behind the fund, is that our investment mandate is widely anchored. So all the political parties agree on kind of the big guidelines, the main guidelines for the fund. It means that when we have a change of government, our investment philosophy does not change, it remains constant.
The government is only allowed to withdraw around 3 to 4% of the fund every year, which accounts for almost a quarter of their annual budget. And the fund generally sees growth rates of around 7%, and they actually own like half of the buildings on Regent Street here in London, along with many other sites across America and Tokyo. Pretty much everyone in Norway sees the fund as a huge success. The CEO of NBIM who runs the fund, Nikolai, previously made his 9-figure fortune in the hedge fund business. And having spent hours listening to him speak, I can confidently say that he's a pretty interesting guy.
So when you went to Wharton and you said you're from Norway, did people in Wharton say, where is that? Or
yeah, of course.
And did they make fun of Norway? Did they say you were a Viking or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I was.
Okay. Okay, so...
He does his job because he just really loves it. It's so multidisciplinary, and he feels like he's doing a good service to the nation. And he even ran for a second term and got it.
I started off in Norway. I studied Russian in the intelligence service. I went to Wharton, did business undergrad, and then I have done some degrees afterwards. I've done one in art history and one in social psychology.
Norway's story is a pretty crazy one. From a rugged, mountainous land that would have screwed over so many others, they've sustainably exploited it to become an essential backbone of resources for Europe. Whether it be ice, timber, paper, fish, fertilizer, or energy, Norway has one of the world's largest trade surpluses. By prioritizing ethics, diversifying early, and investing globally, Norway turned a volatile resource into national stability, proving that with the right systems in place, even a tiny country with the population of a city can quietly shape the world.
our thought from the beginning of the episode was a robot just ran a half marathon. Why? In Beijing, which is the capital of China, 21 humanoid robots competed with thousands of humans in a half marathon. And the winning robot completed the half marathon in 2 hours and 40 minutes, whilst the winning human completed it in only 62 minutes. And for those who are less keen runners than me, 2 hours and 40 minutes is quite a mediocre time, it seems.
I disagree. I actually think this is quite impressive because 2 hours and 40 minutes, whilst it may not be that fast, it's also not particularly slow. And I think it's impressive for a robot in a humanoid model to be running this fast. I think that's kind of crazy, actually.
Yes, I suppose it's sufficiently fast to be actually running as opposed to walking. So, in that sense, we did have a robot that is capable of not just walking but running. So I do see your point. But for me, this highlighted people's obsession with humanoid robots, even though up until now, they have proven to be remarkably useless, in contrary to a lot of specialized robots, which have been proven to be extremely useful in various settings, including manufacturing, but also you could argue that a lot of things we use nowadays are robots, including cars, etc. But anyways, so I was interested to discuss why are people obsessed with humanoid robots? Like, we have so many good specialized robots. Why is the goal not to develop specialized robots? But why is there so much hype around humanoid ones? Sourish, do you have any ideas?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's just cool. I remember the Asimo robot, which I think is 22 years old or something, and I think it was made by Honda or Hyundai, one of those two. And it was kind of the first robot that actually had human-like motion, and therefore you could argue the first robot that could actually run. And I think that's just such a cool robot, and it's kind of like we see machines everywhere, right? Like computers are machines, robots in factories are all machines, but seeing a machine that looks or resembles a human in some way is just different. It's the same way that you may look at like a pet and think, oh, that's adorable, that's cute. It's the same way you look at a humanoid robot differently to other sorts of machines or robots. So I think at the end of the day, it's kind of our fascination and curiosity and desire to have a robot that looks and operates just like us.
It's actually that leads me nicely onto the second point I was wondering about, which is how does the fact that a robot is humanoid change the way that we perceive and interact with them? And I think for me, I was thinking about pet robots as well, right? So I think Sony or somebody released at one point a pet dog that was obviously a robot, and I think that people thought that, or at least people initially thought that it was cute that this robot dog was shaped like a dog, and I think that there is that factor, and I think for some uses of robots, if this robot is in a more humanoid way, it is obviously perceived to be more friendly, and that may be advantageous in certain settings. For example, in a hospital setting, in settings possibly in restaurants, etc., where if you have a purely functional robot, it may look a lot less visually attractive and personable, and so it may be less good at ultimately its job.
Yes, I was just thinking about that actually, because when you go somewhere for the experience, a lot of the time you also kind of want that additional human interaction with, for example, the waiter, the chef, the doctor, or whatever. And whilst it objectively is more efficient in basically every regard to replace these people with robots that aren't humanoids, well, replacing them with a humanoid kind of maintains a lot of that experience. And I think there's a very distinct difference between having robotic waiters that kind of just go on wheels and, like robots that we see in Japanese restaurants in Japan. I think there's a very big difference between that and humanoid robots. And I actually think that's probably the biggest reason that they don't already exist in Western restaurants, because people just don't want them. Whereas I think once humanoid robots get good enough to replace the waiters, then I think robots will begin to make their way into our restaurants.
I think that's an interesting point, because when I was traveling specifically in China, actually, I was ordering food at restaurants using my mobile phone and using a QR code. And so there was no interaction with the waiter from the perspective of ordering food. And I think that, some people really value the positive experience that a good waiter can bring and, good service. And some people enjoy talking about their day with a waiter, for example, and that is certainly considered good service. And so if you replace that with any robot, really, then you're eliminating that, right? And as you said, that's an experience that people enjoy. I do wonder, though, that with the advent of AI, if these humanoid robots can also have AI-driven idiosyncrasies where maybe they have their own unique personalities, then could that really replace the human waiter experience? And I think that's something interesting to think about. Now, personally, I don't think that it actually will, at least for a long time, because I think there'll be a general distaste towards a robot as opposed to a human, even if they're serving a very similar function. I think people will still prefer the human for a very long time.
I disagree. I think this is coming, and I think it's coming very, very, very soon. And in fact, I think we recently saw Figure, which is a company that's trying to build humanoid robots. They just raised a huge amount of money at a crazy high valuation. And so humanoid robots, I think, will replace loads of these people. And I think the AI in them will be so powerful that we will eventually just talk to the AI as if it's simply another human.
Speaking of crazy valuations, Elon Musk, whose company Tesla, which some still believe is a car company, but he believes is actually a robot and AI company, which is of course valued quite highly. They're set to produce 5,000 humanoid robots this year, and Elon Musk actually wants to make more if they can. And I wonder, how big of a role does Elon Musk play in all of this, right? Because to me, he's like the biggest advocate for humanoid robots. I mean, he's the biggest advocate for many things, right? But I do wonder, like him specifically, what role does he have in the robot space? Because I think if he didn't have such an obsession with humanoid robots in particular, we wouldn't have so many people trying to make these robots that look like humans. I think the robotics industry would be focused on other things, personally. And I think Elon Musk is really actually drawing the focus towards humanoid robots specifically, and for more robots to be essentially human lookalikes.
I think I actually agree there because, robotics companies and startups, it clearly makes so much more sense for them to focus on robots that they can kind of sell today and make tons of money on, which are very much not humanoid robots. If they can sell robots that are specialized to different tasks in different industries, there is a ton of money in that industry and in that sector that's just waiting to be taken by a robotics startup. And yet we see a fair amount of companies putting most of their resources towards developing humanoid robots. And I think a lot of that hype does indeed come from Elon Musk and his fan base.
Yes, and as you mentioned, in the present moment, humanoid robots may not be the most useful kind. But I was pondering, where could they actually be useful? And I think, the obvious answer is for them to replace humans, right? And I think the easiest way, or the most socially palatable, would be for them to replace humans in a possibly dangerous situation. So that might be crash tests, right? If you had robots which behaved more like humans and you put them in crash tests, that would possibly improve safety. I was thinking of military uses where you could possibly test weapons even, or if you had dangerous explosives, right? These things you could use humanoid robots to help develop them, and possibly that would give you better results whilst obviously not endangering any humans. But back to the point that we were talking about earlier, I do think that hospitality and some of these roles where from a physical perspective you're not necessarily performing particularly intricate tasks, right? A plate is not necessarily the most difficult thing to carry. These places, I can see that in the future, robots will be good enough to replace humans. And I think the question is not if the robots will be good enough, it is rather, will it be palatable to the general population, and will people want to go to a restaurant with robot waiters, or will they be willing to possibly even pay more to go to a restaurant where actual humans are present? Because if that's the case, then you could have the best robots in the world, but it's not being very useful, right?
Yeah, I do think that the highest level of experience, even today, is where there is the most human interaction per given customer, right? So you can pay a lot of money to go get like one-on-one tours of different places, and that always costs more than just like a group tour or a speaking tour or a walking tour. And that's because humans really value this social connection, and I think we will always value that. So yes, I do think, even if most restaurants then get robots to kind of run the restaurant for them, there will still be this higher tier of restaurants that will be run by humans. Definitely the Michelin star restaurants, and definitely all of the restaurants that you go for the experience. The restaurants you go for a birthday and not just to eat some food.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And check out the description to sign up to our weekly newsletter. You can also reach out to us on X at the WaffleByte. See you there. Reels are stupid.